There's a small stretch of land tucked between two countries where something has been quietly defying every rule of European history. It sits in the folds of the Pyrenees, straddling the border of France and Spain, and the people who live there speak a language that connects to nothing else on the planet. Not French, not Spanish, not Latin, not even the ancient tongues that gave birth to almost every language spoken across Europe today. When scientists finally turned their instruments toward the blood and bones of these people, they expected to find an explanation. What they found instead was a puzzle that only grew larger the closer they looked. I did not set out to learn about the Basque people. I was reading about something completely different, some unrelated thread about ancient migrations, when their name kept resurfacing in footnote after footnote. Every time historians tried to explain where European languages came from, they had to pause and admit that one group simply did not fit the pattern. That pause turned into curiosity, and the curiosity turned into weeks of reading I never planned on doing. Here's the puzzle in its simplest form. Nearly every language spoken across Europe, from Portuguese to Polish, from Norwegian to Nepali, traces back to a single root. Linguists call it Proto-Indo-European, a language believed to have been spoken by herders on the grassy plains of Eurasia thousands of years before written history began. As those early speakers spread outward, their language splintered into dozens of branches, then hundreds of dialects, then eventually into the entire family tree of tongues we hear across the continent now. English belongs to that family, so does Russian, so does Hindi, spoken thousands of miles away in South Asia. It is one of the largest, most successful linguistic family trees in human history, except for one language. Euskara, spoken by the Basque people, refuses to join that tree at any branch. It is not a distant cousin of French or Spanish. It is not related to Celtic tongues or to the older languages that once covered the Iberian Peninsula before Rome arrived. Linguists have searched for a relative for over a century and found nothing. No sister language, no dead ancestor tongue buried in old inscriptions. Euskara stands by itself, a linguistic island with no bridge connecting it to anywhere else humans have ever spoken. The strangeness does not stop at its isolation. When the Roman Empire swept across Iberia, it left its fingerprints on nearly every culture it touched, reshaping local languages by flooding them with Latin vocabulary. Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and Romanian are essentially Latin's descendants wearing different regional clothing. Basque barely absorbed any of it. Centuries of Roman occupation came and went, yet Euskara kept its own words for the things that mattered most. Its number system counts in blocks of 20 rather than blocks of 10, a structure so different from the rest of Europe that it hints at a way of thinking about the world that formed long before anyone nearby was counting the same way. Some of its most basic words, the ones for stone, for water, for fire, are considered by linguists to be among the oldest surviving fragments of vocabulary spoken anywhere on Earth today. I tried once to pick up a handful of Basque phrases before a hiking trip through the mountains where it is still spoken. I have dabbled in enough languages to usually find some kind of foothold, a familiar root word, a recognizable grammar pattern borrowed from somewhere. With Basque, there was nothing to grab onto, no shortcuts, no echoes of French or Latin waiting to help me guess a meaning. It felt less like learning a new dialect and more like being handed a code with no key. At the time, it was just frustrating. Later, once I understood the deeper story, that frustration made a lot more sense. A language that refuses to resemble its neighbors is not an accident. It is evidence of something. Linguistics was only the beginning of the mystery. In the middle of the 20th century, doctors studying blood types across Basque communities noticed something that had no clean medical explanation. Basque populations carry the highest concentration of Rh negative blood found anywhere in the world. In some of the more isolated valleys, close to half the population tested Rh negative, compared with roughly 15% across the rest of Europe. Alongside that, they also showed unusually high rates of type O blood, creating a genetic fingerprint that did not resemble any neighboring population, not the Spanish to the south, not the French to the north. That detail matters more than it might sound. Blood type frequencies are not something that stay fixed forever. When populations intermarry and blend across generations, unusual blood type frequencies tend to drift toward whatever is common in the wider region. The fact that Basque communities had kept their Rh negative numbers so far above everyone around them suggested one thing very strongly. For a very long stretch of time, they simply had not been mixing much with outsiders. That raised an obvious question nobody could answer with the tools available at the time. Were the Basques, the last surviving descendants of the hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe before farming ever arrived, a population that had somehow avoided being absorbed by every wave of newcomers that followed? Or were they migrants from somewhere else entirely, arriving from an unknown origin and only becoming isolated after they settled in the mountains? Researchers argued both sides for decades without anything close to proof. Blood type data could tell you that isolation had happened. It could not tell you when it began, or why it lasted, or where these people had truly come from in the first place. For most of the 20th century, the Basques remained a question that refused to close. Everything changed once scientists gained the ability to read ancient DNA directly out of old bones and teeth. What had been an argument based on blood types and guesswork suddenly became something that could be measured with real precision. A landmark study published in 2021 finally brought clarity, led by a research team out of Barcelona. The scale of the project was enormous. Researchers analyzed roughly 600,000 genetic markers across 200 Basque individuals, each one chosen carefully because all 4 of their grandparents had been born in the same small geographic region, ensuring the samples reflected deep local ancestry rather than recent movement. They compared this data against nearly 2,000 other individuals sampled from populations across Europe and the Mediterranean world. It was, by a wide margin, the most detailed genetic study of Basque ancestry ever conducted. The results overturned the migration theory almost entirely. There was no hidden outside population arriving from a mysterious homeland, no lost civilization quietly depositing its genes into the mountains before vanishing from history. Instead, the data revealed something that felt, in its own way, even more remarkable than a dramatic migration story. It revealed continuity, unbroken, extraordinary continuity, stretching back well over 2,000 years into the Iron Age. Here's the detail that genuinely stopped me when I first read through the findings. Genetic material recovered from Iron Age burial sites in the Basque region is almost indistinguishable from the DNA of Basque people living today. Compare that to nearly every other population across Europe, where a few centuries of migration, conquest, and trade is usually enough to reshape a population's genetic makeup dramatically. The average person living in Spain today carries traceable ancestry from at least half a dozen distinct historical populations, layered on top of each other through Roman settlement, Visigothic rule, centuries of Moorish presence in the south, earlier farming migrants, and steppe pastoralists sweeping in from the east thousands of years earlier. All of that churn reshaped the genetic landscape of the entire peninsula. The Basques absorbed almost none of it. While the genetic map of Europe was being rewritten again and again around them, their population stayed remarkably still. The lead researcher on the 2021 study described the pattern as something without any real precedent elsewhere on the continent, a statement that carries real weight coming from someone who has spent a career studying exactly this kind of population history. The conclusion was clear. The Basques were not outsiders who had wandered into the Pyrenees from somewhere unknown. They were the people who had always been there, still recognizably themselves after thousands of years during which almost everyone else around them had been transformed by wave after wave of newcomers. Once the broad picture of continuity became clear, researchers dug deeper into the population and found something even more unexpected. This isolation had not happened passively. It was not simply the mountains acting as a natural wall keeping outsiders away. The Pyrenees are real mountains, but they are far from impassable. Traders crossed them, armies crossed them, pilgrims, merchants, and soldiers moved through those valleys for thousands of years. Geography alone cannot explain what the genetic data showed. What actually preserved this genetic distinctiveness, according to the data, was language itself. The correlation was strikingly precise. Communities where Euskara had been spoken continuously through history showed the strongest genetic isolation from surrounding populations. Regions where the language had once been spoken but was gradually lost over time showed a middle pattern, a kind of genetic blurring at the edges where mixing had slowly crept in. And areas where Basque had never taken root at all showed genetic profiles that blended much more closely with neighboring Spanish and French populations. The boundary of the language and the boundary of the genetics lined up almost perfectly. The detail goes even further than that. Different dialects of Basque, spoken in different valleys only a short distance apart, correlate with distinct genetic subpopulations. Researchers found they could predict, with meaningful accuracy, which dialect a person's ancestors likely spoke based on nothing but their DNA. Communities separated by no more than 15 kilometers showed genetic differences large enough that you would normally expect to see them between populations on opposite ends of the continent, not between 2 neighboring mountain valleys. Take the shepherding communities of the Roncal Valley in Navarre as one striking example. They speak their own distinct variant of Basque, and their genetic profile has remained essentially stable for over 1,000 years. Marriage records surviving from the 16th century show that more than 9 out of every 10 Basques married within their own dialect group, not simply within the broader Basque-speaking world, but within the specific linguistic variant spoken in their own valley. The language was not a side effect of isolation. It was the actual mechanism driving it. People chose partners who spoke like them, generation after generation, and that choice quietly built a wall stronger than any mountain range. Step back for a moment and think about what this really means for the rest of Europe. Most of the continent's genetic history reads like a document that has been written over again and again, older text scraped away and replaced by newer layers. Farmers arriving from the eastern Mediterranean thousands of years ago displaced or absorbed the original hunter-gatherer populations of Europe. Waves of pastoralist herders swept in from the Eurasian steppe during the Bronze Age and reshaped the genetic makeup of nearly the entire continent. Then came the Romans, the Germanic tribes, the Slavic expansions, and the slow, steady churn of movement and intermarriage that never really stopped through the medieval period. Layer after layer, until the original genetic text of ancient Europe was almost completely buried. Almost completely. Geneticists now describe the Basque population as a genetic refuge, a group that absorbed so little of the successive migrations sweeping across Europe that their genome still preserves a signature of the continent as it existed before all that overwriting began. When researchers compare modern Basque DNA against ancient samples taken from before the Great Bronze Age population movements, the similarity is striking in a way that simply does not hold true for any other living European population. Looking at a Basque person today means looking, in a very real biological sense, further back into European prehistory than is possible almost anywhere else on the continent. The cultural record backs this up from a completely different angle. Traditional Basque inheritance customs concentrated family property within a single household line, discouraging children from marrying outward and scattering the family's holdings. Basque women historically held property rights and social independence that had few parallels anywhere else in medieval Europe, which meant marriage within the community was often a matter of genuine choice rather than families trading daughters outward for political or economic advantage. Basque mythology, meanwhile, is filled with ancient earth goddesses and nature spirits that predate the religious frameworks brought in by Indo-European speaking cultures. None of these details are simply charming folklore. They are independent lines of evidence coming from a completely different field of study, all pointing toward the same conclusion. Something here survived that almost everywhere else was lost. After spending real time inside this research, one idea kept surfacing that the mountains alone cannot explain. The Pyrenees did not save the Basque people. That is the easy, comfortable explanation, and it simply does not hold up against the evidence. Plenty of populations elsewhere in the world lived behind mountain ranges far more forbidding than the Pyrenees, and still saw their genetics transformed within a handful of centuries. Mountains slow down armies. They do nothing to stop trade routes, wandering merchants, or the slow cultural pull that neighboring societies exert on each other across generations. Something else was clearly at work. What the evidence points toward is a kind of sustained collective choice, a community that decided, generation after generation, to remain itself, to marry within the language, to pass property down established family lines, to maintain customs and social structures tight enough that outside influence rarely found an easy way in. Language was the mechanism that made this possible, but the language itself had to be actively maintained. It had to be taught to children in every generation, kept alive through centuries when abandoning it would have been far easier and often more practical. That has implications well beyond this one mountain community. It suggests that identity, when it is maintained on purpose and passed forward with real intention, can outlast almost any physical barrier humans have ever built. There is a practical side to this story as well, beyond the historical and philosophical implications. Because Basque populations represent such an unusually unmixed genetic baseline, they have become genuinely valuable to researchers studying human disease and biology, offering a clearer picture of certain genetic patterns before centuries of intermixing complicated the data everywhere else. What once looked like nothing more than an interesting quirk of isolation has turned into a real scientific resource. And that genetic thread runs directly into the present, into ordinary people living today in Bilbao and Bayonne and San Sebastian, each one carrying something ancient and continuous inside their own biology, something that links them, in a measurable and documented way, to a version of Europe that no longer exists anywhere else on the continent. That is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a measurable scientific fact confirmed by some of the most detailed genetic research ever conducted on a single population. The DNA did not make the mystery of the Basque people disappear. If anything, it confirmed that the mystery had been real all along. What genetics ultimately provided was not a tidy, simple answer, but something arguably more valuable than that. Proof that a people can remain genuinely, measurably themselves across more than 2,000 years of pressure, invasion, and transformation happening on every side of them. Not through isolation by accident, and not because of the shape of the mountains they happen to live in, but through a choice renewed continuously across hundreds of generations by people who decided their language and their identity were worth keeping. That is what makes their story extraordinary. Not simply that they survived, because plenty of ancient cultures survived in some diluted, half-remembered form. The Basque people survived intact, a living thread stretching back to a version of Europe that exists nowhere else on Earth, still speaking a language no one else can trace, still recognizably, unmistakably themselves,